Hey everybody, today we are going to officially talk a little bit more in depth about the cell cycle and mitosis. So the cell cycle takes a look at basically the birth of cells to the death of cells and also the maturity that they go through over time. So when we look right here, this is where the cell is born. Here is where the cell is eventually going to split into two. So this whole green circle going around, about 90% of the cell cycle is called interphase, and that is not a stage of mitosis, but it's a stage where the cell is going through growth, it's making more DNA, the S stands for synthesis, and then it's growing again. That way when it splits, it's not so dramatic and it's not super tiny, it's not incapable of life, it's still able to have life. So today we're going to focus mainly on mitosis, which is the splitting of the nucleus. And this step only happens in eukaryotic cells because eukaryotic cells have a nucleus. Pro means no, they do not have a nucleus, and so they go through a little bit of a separate type of process called prokaryotic fission or binary fission. So now if we look at this diagram, this interphase is actually not part of the process of mitosis. This is its own thing, so it includes G1, S, and G2. The steps prophase, metaphase, and anaphase also are part of mitosis, as is telophase and then cytokinesis. So let's break it down a little bit further. So the first step of, or just the overall definition of mitosis, is the splitting of the nucleus. The first step is prophase, and the best way to describe prophase is that during interphase, the nucleus is all scrambled. During prophase, instead of it being scrambled, it starts to condense into these X's that we call chromosomes. We also see that the boundary of the nucleus, called the nuclear envelope, is also going to break up. And these little, usually they're star-shaped things, are also going to start to migrate towards the poles, because when they eventually split, they're going to separate. Metaphase, the way to remember this, is metaphase middle. The chromosomes are going to line up right at the equator or the middle of the cell. And now we also see that these centrioles, are going to be at the poles. We also see that the fishing line, and that does have a specific name, they're called spindle fibers. Consider it like a fish hook. They are hooked onto the fish, but they're not yet reeling them in. That fish are the chromosomes. After they are hooked, then they start reeling them in, which brings us to our next step, and that's called anaphase. Now, the way that you can remember this is as these X's are starting to be pulled apart to each pole, they kind of look like the letter A for anaphase. So here I could just say, oh, this is letter A, so forth. And so now we're reeling in those chromosomes, and the X's are now being split right in half into what we call the chromatids, all right, which basically stands for half a chromosome. After anaphase, the cell is going to start to pinch a little bit, so it's going to kind of look like the number 8, and then that chromatids are going to start to scramble each other again, and you'll actually have 2 nuclei in one single cell. And so telophase means to have 2 nuclei in one cell. So these 4 steps, if we go back, prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase, they are the 4 steps of mitosis because they're dealing with the splitting of the nucleus. Now there's also an additional step called cytokinesis. Cytocell kinesis is when we're going to split the cell. So this process is going to begin right during telophase because as that cell starts to look like the number 8, that cytokinesis is already starting. And so eventually there's a little cell membrane that starts to pinch off. They're going to squeeze together and form 2 new identical cells. And that's the process of mitosis. So if we look at a quick overview again, this whole green is called interphase, and that's where it's growing. It's doubling DNA. So instead of the DNA looking like a single propeller, it's going to double its DNA. So they're going to look like X's. And I'm talking about chromosomes here. It's going to go through a second stage of growth. That way when it splits, that's the splitting of the nucleus, and then the splitting of the cell is not so dramatic. So that's our quick overview on the cell cycle and mitosis.